Hi there and welcome to another episode of Hollenbeck Unleashed. Well, the first thing Shinzo Abe did when he became Prime Minister was to call on the Bank of Japan to do something about the problem of deflation and of course the problem of the strong yen. Well, I have Frank Hollebeck in the studio and we're going to have a look at this in a little bit more detail. So Frank, do you think deflation is really the problem?
Well, when it comes to deflation, economics is no longer the science of common sense, it's the science of nonsense. Many economists will tell you that a little bit of inflation is a good thing and they fear deflation. However, in their personal lives, these same economists will scour the newspapers to find the latest sales. And the person who epitomizes this fear of deflation is Ben Bernanke, the current chairman of the Federal Reserve System. And that's because his work on the Great Depression has created an enormous amount of bias against deflation. Now, it is true that the Great Depression and deflation went hand in hand for some countries. However, a recent study by Akison and Keogh showed that for 17 countries over a period of 180 years, there was no association between deflation and depressions. And they actually found that there was a greater number of episodes of inflation with depressions than deflation with depressions. Now, the basic argument against deflation is that if prices are falling, people will postpone their purchases to be able to purchase the products at a cheaper price. But this postponing of consumption causes prices to fall even more, so that we end up with somewhat of a deflation, what we can call a deflation, depression, death spiral. So that in this particular example, it's the deflation that creates the depression. Okay. Now, there are several problems with this particular view. Okay. The first problem is that we always prefer to consume today than to consume tomorrow. And it actually takes a significant reduction in price to induce us to postpone our consumption. For example, would you be willing to wait an hour if the price of a bus ticket was 10 cents cheaper? Or would you be willing to wait 10 hours if it was $1 cheaper? We can see that a lot of high technology products have had brisk demand, even though they are producing goods in a deflationary environment. And we can see that Apple still has brisk demand for its latest version of the iPhone, even though we know that the price of that iPhone is likely to be significantly lower 6 months down the road. The second problem with this argument is that it assumes that people base their expectations only on past prices. The reality is that people base their expectations on a multitude of different factors, where inflation is just one of those factors. Okay, and it's a bit like I'm sure that a lot of the economists at the Fed are somewhat surprised that people have not reacted to lower interest rates as they did when we lowered interest rates after the dot-com bubble in 2001. And the reason is that human actions really can't be modeled as we would model the reactions of lab rats in a biology experiment. Now, the third problem with this argument is that if we are consuming less, then we must be saving more. That implies that investment in capital goods must also be much higher. So that this reduction in consumption spending doesn't necessarily mean a reduction in aggregate demand. In other words, we are spending less on consumer goods, but we're spending more on capital goods, in other words, on buildings and plant and equipment. Okay, so that if we have this occurring, then we are going to have more growth and probably more goods and services into the future. This is actually a beneficial aspect of deflation.
And Frank, many countries implemented quantitative easing to fight off deflation in 2008. Now, was this exactly the good strategy?
Well, let me give you a very simple example. Suppose that you have 10 pencils and $10. Now, the price of the pencils can't be $2 per pencil because then we'd have pencils that wouldn't be sold, and it can't be 50 cents because then we'd have people with money looking for pencils to purchase. So the price of the pencil will be $1. Now, suppose that the cost of production is 80 cents, or I should say the cost of the inputs, the labor, the wood, the lead is 80 cents. Now, suppose that we have people hoard $5. And what I mean by hoarding is stuffing money in your mattress. In other words, taking claims on goods and services out of the economy. This is different than savings. There's a difference between savings and hoarding. Now, what will happen is prices will fall. They'll fall to 50 cents. Now, we don't have a problem if input prices also fall. Suppose that input prices fall to 40 cents. We were making a 25% profit before, and we're making a 25% profit now. What economists are worried about is that the input prices won't fall as fast as the output prices. They fear that because of wage stickiness, the input prices will stay at 80 cents. So we end up with producing a cost of 80 cents, which we sell at 50 cents. So this creates bankruptcies, unemployment, and then maybe even lower output. So maybe we're only producing 8 pencils instead of 10 pencils, which leads to lower prices and so on and so on. So you get the story of the deflation, depression, death spiral that I just discussed. Now, a lot of economists say, well, then what we need is the central bank to come in and simply print $5. So we still have 10 pencils and $10, and we've avoided this deflation, depression, death spiral. Okay. Now, the problem with this argument is, the first argument is that we normally have a certain amount of stickiness in both input prices and output prices. In other words, you don't want to have your salary changing every day, nor do you want to have to check up the hourly price on the latest theater tickets. Okay, so we normally have stickiness in both input and output prices. So the key is how fast do output prices fall relative to input prices. In other words, how long is the lag between the change in output prices and input prices? If the lag is relatively short, then the policy prescription that I just described may be unnecessary and even counterproductive. We have to remember that entrepreneurs basically are there to forecast output prices, and then they bid for input prices to make a profit. So if we assume that entrepreneurs are in the business of making money, we can actually anticipate that the lag is relatively short. Now, we also have to recognize that printing money is not neutral. Okay? When we print money, the early receivers of the money, which is the government and the banking sectors, are the winners relative to the late receivers of the money, which are the wage earners and the poor. Okay? We can think of printing money as being somewhat of a reverse Robin Hood, in the sense that we're taking from the poor to give to the rich. And we also have to recognize that when the government prints $5 and gives it to the rich will spend it in such a way that it alters relative prices. Okay. Now, we also have a situation is what happens when things improve. Suppose that things get better and people take their money out of hoarding. So we now have 10 pencils and $15. So prices will go from $1 to $1.50 unless the central bank actually pulls out the $5 that they put into the system. But if they do that, it's going to cause a change in relative prices, just as it caused a change in relative prices when they put the $5 in the system. So you really have to wonder, are we better off with this medicine? In other words, is the medicine worse than the disease? The real solution is not to allow the money supply to drop from $10 to $5. If we eliminated the fractional reserve banking system, implemented the Chicago plan, and ended central banks, then the public could not increase their hoarding by $5. In other words, neither the banks nor the public could change their cash holdings.
And finally, Shinzo Abe has actually indicated if the Bank of Japan fails to reach its 2% target, he will look for some changes. Now, Frank, Frank, do you actually think inflation is the solution?
Well, for me, inflation is much worse than deflation. Central banks are the main reason that we've had this increase in income inequalities since the demise of the Bretton Woods system in 1971 and its replacement with fiat currencies. In reality, deflation is linked to growth. Okay. In other words, if you take the example I gave you before, where we had $10 at 10 pencils, and I increase the number of pencils to 20 pencils, then prices will go from $1 to 50 cents. And that is a good thing because your dollars can purchase more goods and services. In reality, what you're doing is you're pushing the limits of scarcity. You can never eliminate scarcity or all prices would be zero. But deflation reflects the fact that we have a more abundance of products, of goods and services. For example, the greatest period of growth in the United States was between 1825 and 1850 and 1865 and 1900. During that time period, prices were cut in half. In other words, we had a significant increase in the standard of living of the average person. Okay. A world without fractional reserve banking, without a central bank, would be a world of deflation, which should be hailed as one of man's greatest achievements, which is the improvement of the standard of living for all.
Thanks, Frank. Well, viewers, that's it for right now, but do tune back in later for more economic updates and Forex analysis. But for now, goodbye.